Socio-economic structure and peasant revolt. The Moamoria insurrection in 18th century Assam. Chapter 1. Structural foundations of power. The Ahom state as an extraction mechanism. The Ahom polity was not a benign administrative system, it was a calibrated apparatus designed for maximum extraction for labor and surplus. Its longevity didn't derive from efficiency but from control density, tight integrations of administrative, military, and economic functions. Over centuries, what began as a relatively flexible tribal formation hardened into a rigid, stratified order. This transition marked the shift from negotiated authority to imposed dominance. By the 16th century, the Ahom state had decisively moved from a feudal mode of production where land, labor, and political authority were monopolized by a narrowing ruling class. This transformation didn't increase resilience, it reduced adaptability. Systems that centralize extraction without parallel investment in productivity inevitably degrade. Chapter 2. The Pike System. Codified coercion and the elimination of autonomy. The Pike system functioned as the core mechanism of socio-economic control. Every male subject was registered, categorized, and assigned obligations. This was not labor organization, it was labor conscription embedded into social fabric. Each pike was required to serve the state for a fixed period annually, often without compensation, effectively converting human capital into a non-numerated input for elite consumption. The structural flaw was immediate. There was no incentive alignment. Productivity was irrelevant because output didn't translate into individual gain. The pike had no ownership stake in the means of or results of production. However, this eroded both efficiency and compliance. When individuals are reduced to instruments, they optimize for survival, not performance. The system created a labor base that was controlled but disengaged, a configuration that guarantees eventual resistance. Chapter number 3. Administrative control through the Khel system, distributed surveillance, and layered exploitation. The Khel system extended state control into localized administrative units. It categorized populations based on occupation, geography, ensuring that every individual was accounted for and regulated. This was not decentralization in the modern sense. It was the multiplication of control nodes. Each Khel acted as a micro administration responsible for labor mobilization, tax collection, and discipline enforcement. The problem was structural layering. Each administrative level extracted its own share of surplus, compounding the burden on the production class. This created a cascading extraction effect where peasants were subjected to multiple points of pressure. Instead of optimizing governance, the system amplified inefficiency and resentment. Surveillance without legitimacy produces compliance only up to the point where enforcement weakens. Beyond that, it accelerates defections. Chapter 4. Class stratification, institutionalized inequality, and the freezing of mobility. The socio-economic order of the Ahom state evolved into a rigid hierarchy. At the top were the ruling elites, royalty, nobility, high-ranking officials who controlled land, labor, and political authority. Beneath them were the intermediary groups, including artisans and ordinary pikes, who generated surplus but lacked decision-making power. At the bottom were servitors, bonded groups with minimal authority. This structure was not merely economic, it was institutional. Privileged class such as the Chauma enjoyed exemptions from labor obligations and accumulated wealth through control of resources. Meanwhile, the majority remained locked in subsistence conditions. This system eliminated vertical mobility. When upward mobility is structurally blocked, the only available direction is horizontal conflict. Inequality becomes combustible when it is both visible and immovable. Chapter number 5. Land tenure and revenue extraction. Ownership without rights. Land in the Ahom state was formally owned by the king, but in practice control was delegated to elites and religious institutions. Peasants were granted only usufruct rights, temporary use without ownership. This arrangement ensured that reduces both the risks of cultivation while elites captured the surplus. Revenue extraction extended beyond basic obligations. Peasants faced multiple layers of taxation, including rent on additional land, service commutated commutation fees, service commutation fees, and various indirect levies. As more land was granted tax-free to elites and satras, the fiscal burden concentrated on the remaining productive base. This created a classic over-extraction scenario, diminishing returns from a shrinking pool of taxpayers. This system consumed its own foundation. Chapter number 6: Religious institutions and as economic actors, from ideology to control. New, the neo-Vaishnavite satras initially emerged as egalitarian spiritual centers but evolved into significant economic entities. They accumulated land, controlled neighbor, and exercised judicial authority. In effect, they became parallel power structures that mirrored the exploitative practices of the state. The Moamoria Satra diverged by attracting marginalized groups, including lower caste and tribal populations. This created an alternative network of allegiance outside state control. The failed state to neutralize this divergence, allowing a parallel organization structure to consolidate. This was a strategic oversight. Institutional when an alternative institution can mobilize discontent populations, it becomes a latent insurgency platform. Chapter 7: Accumulation of Contradictions, Systematic Pressure Points. The Ahom system didn't collapse due to a single cause. It failed because multiple contradictions intensified simultaneously. Economic extraction extended subsistence capacity. Social hierarchy prevented mobility. Religious divisions fragmented legitimacy. Administrative overreach generated inefficiency. The dominant contradiction remained between the exploited peasantry and the ruling elite. However, secondary contradictions amplified instability. These included tensions between different satras, conflict within the ruling class, and regional disparities in control. The system reached a saturation point where incremental pressure translated into exponential instability. At that stage, collapse became non-linear, and rapid. Chapter 8: The Moamoria Revolts, Execution Without Strategy. The Moamoria uprising unfolded in multiple phases, each demonstrating tactical aggression but strategic deficiency. The first revolt in 1769 achieved rapid success, including the capture of the capital. This indicates that the state control mechanisms were already weakened. However, the levels failed to consolidate power. There was no administrative blueprint, no centralized command, no mechanism for sustaining authority. The subsequent revolts repeated the same pattern. Mobilization was strong, but coordination was weak. Gains were temporary because they were not institutionalized. The rebels operated as a force of disruption, not governance. This distinction is decisive. Destruction without replacement creates a vacuum, not a transition. Chapter 9: Military Limitations, Irregular Force Against Structured Power. The rebel forces relied on peasant militias, guerrilla tactics, and rudimentary weaponry. This strength fluctuated with agricultural cycles, leading to inconsistent engagement capacity. There was no standing army, no supply chain, and no long-term strategic planning. In contrast, the state, despite its internal weakness, retained a structured military apparatus. This asymmetry ensured that the rebel successes were episodic. Without logistical continuity, even high-intensity offensives degrade rapidly. The inability to sustain pressure allowed the state to recover and counterattack. Tactical victories without strategic depth and are self-canceling. External invention, confirmation of internal failure. The involvement of external forces, particularly the Britain, was not an anomaly. It was a consequence. When a state loses the ability to enforce order internally, it becomes dependent on external stabilization. The Ahom state required British intervention to suppress the revolts. This marked the effective erosion of sovereignty. External intervention doesn't restore strength, it masks weakness. It introduces new power dynamics that the original system cannot control. The immediate effect was the suppression of rebellion. The long-term effect was opening of the region to colonial domination. Chapter 11: Structural Consequences, Collapse, Transition, and Replacement. The Moamoria uprising dismantled key components of the Ahom socio-economic system. including the pike and kale structures. This forced a tradition towards a more monetized economy, a weakened feudal controls. However, the transition was unplanned and unstable. The absence of the coherent replacement system created a power vacuum. This vacuum invited further instability, including internal fragmentation, external invasion. The Burmese incursions and eventual British colonization were not isolated events, they were downstream consequences of systematic collapse. When a system fails to regenerate, it is replaced by the external one. Chapter 12. Final analysis, predictable collapse, and failed transformations. The Ahom state engineered its own downfall through extensive extraction, rigid hierarchy, and failure to adopt. The Moamoria rebels accelerated this process but didn't control its outcome. They identified the structural weakness and exploited them, but they lacked the capacity to construct an alternative order. This result The result was a transfer of power rather than its elimination. The internal elite lost control and external forces filled the vacuum. The system changed form, not function. Extraction continued under new management. Conclusion: structural logic overrides intent. The Moamoria revolts demonstrate a consistent principle system collapsed when extraction exceeds sustainability and adaptation is suppressed. Resistance emerges not from ideology but from necessity. However, resistance alone is insufficient. Without institutional design, coordination, and long-term planning, rebellion produces disruption, not transformation. The system is deterministic. The power doesn't dissipate, it reallocates.